Hello everyone, welcome to another artwork analysis. Now, in light of some artwork mistakes I've done in recent times, I had to really look back into the originators of some of my influences, and one of them is Frank Frazetta. Now, Frank Frazetta, I feel like, is an artist that is sort of hit or miss for a lot of people. Nowadays, when we look back at his work tends to be very campy to some people. It's a little bit over exaggerated at times, but I really want to mention that I feel like he influenced an entire generation of artists. He sort of did the really fantasy look. A lot of games, a lot of media nowadays really took his ideas and really sort of pushed it forward. But he was the pioneer of this type of fantasy art. So what do I really want to focus on when it comes to his work, and why I feel like even for me I can still learn off of his work? So one would be his incredible use of shadows, even if it's a little bit over exaggerated and not as naturalistic as others. He knows his stuff and he is very good at depicting shadows. Number two is the idea of focus, which kind of links into shadows and the next criteria, which is the designing for a book cover. So I want to talk about shadows first. So without a doubt, if you look at any Frank Frazetta piece, you'll notice the heavy use of black or full black. What I mean by that is it's not necessarily pitch black out of the tube, but more like this is a sort of a mixture. Usually to the warm side for Frank Frazetta. Other artists might do other things differently. So you'll notice that if you squint your eyes, which I'm doing right now, you'll realize the composition is really divided into two different ways. Where the shadows are and where the light is. It's heavily defined. I'm going to draw out the lights, to be honest. So barring the background, which I'm not going to put down, if you squint your eye, you realize the shape of the lights and the shapes of the darkness are insanely defined. This is part of composition. The reason why he does this is because it leads your eye towards where he wants to go. So a lot of cases, you see the arrows, the implied arrows. This is going to be very rough. I'm not going to draw everything. You see the implied arrows when it comes to his shadows, and it creates a movement towards this Viking's head. Very clever use. Now it has to make sense too. He deliberately had the shadows so that it will fit his criteria for what he needs to focus on. So this is one of those things where, in addition, I have to talk about focus as well. I can't really separate them. So you also notice that his shadows are very simplified. There is a certain portion of values where it starts to just sort of meld together. When you squint your eyes looking at this piece, you realize that all the shadows are basically one value when you squint your eyes, when you're looking at the big picture. And I'm going to give you a sort of like a quick diagram as to why that happens and what artists do to create this effect. So there's something that I've actually listened to with a Pixar lecture, so I'm not advertising this, but feel free to look into schoolism.com for the lectures to really understand and really get a more in-depth explanation of what I'm going to say. Our human eyes can only focus on a certain range of values at a given time. So for instance, if you focus on the lights, your lights become very complex. There's a lot more values. And then once you hit the darkness, when you squint your eyes, everything just looks like this. This is going to happen every single time in reality. Our human eyes are unable to focus on both complex shadows and complex light. So let's say you want to do a piece that is a complex shadow piece. So we're focusing on this, and then everything else looks like just pure white, or something close to that. When we are doing a piece naturalistically, we are trying to emulate human vision. These two situations are literally the only two ways you can create a naturalistic piece. There is no such thing as, again, a complex shadow piece and a complex light piece, because our eyes are unable to focus on both value ranges at the same time. It's literally impossible. Never do that. So in Frank Frazetta's case, you notice that the lit area, so stuff like this, is a lot more complex than the shadows here. Yes, there are a little bit of breakup with the shadows, so it's not just pure black. You don't want to do this either, obviously. But again, he did it just subtle enough so that it's sort of like just having pure darkness. I'm exaggerating here and with the other diagram, but understand that, again, it had the shadows been more complex, if there's more range to it, we're going to start being a little bit confused. So Frank Frazetta has this masterful way of creating just one giant shadow shape. Again, don't see it as, okay, it has to be one value, but don't break it down into a trillion different values like you would do for your lights here. Whoops. So this piece, we are focused on the light. So you see how the lit areas all have a very complex articulation to it. We are focused on those portions. Therefore, the shadows become very diluted, and they're only there for the movement and to carve out the lit shapes. That is really the crux of focus. So you notice that here even stuff like this, those little shapes here are going to be breaking down the lit shapes. Actually, no, that doesn't really change properly. I wanted to mention that the reason why Frank Frazetta doesn't just have one pitch black shadow for everything is because, of course, life is more complex than that. Reality is more complex. And in addition to that, we have to consider that for the sake of composition, we need a bit more breakdown. Imagine if you just had one giant shape here. One big shape. This kind of becomes a gigantic void of attention seeking. It's not going to work very well, especially given that we do not want to focus on the shadows for this piece. So what he does is he adds a little bit of complexity, brings some of the light to the shadows, and brings some of the darks to the lights. You're sort of like creating more interesting shapes rather than just having a blob of shadow. And then you end up with something that's a little bit more appealing to look at, and something that you don't really have to worry about when it comes to getting too distracting. Hopefully that makes sense. So you'll notice that, again, I was pointing out there are places where there's shadows here. So it's like using the deltoid here as an excuse to break up the shape of this light. And of course you have muscles here as well. The fact that these muscles are linking towards the shadows here, it's sort of like breaking a bigger shape. It's creating a nicer shape. And you see the belt here. There's little passages of light here. He's making more interesting shapes out of something that could be just fully in shadow. In reality, I feel like had this been rendered perfectly realistic, this belt would be much more into shadows. But that's really not appealing, right? There's a little bit interest to just putting that little bit of light to it, to this belt. And it sort of, again, breaks up a larger shape and makes it more interesting to look at. So, finally, I want to talk about the final topic, which is designing for a book cover. Now, if you Google Frank Frazetta right now, you notice that most of his compositions are very stark in light and shadow, and everything seems to be centered. So, why is this working? So, this is actually pretty simple, actually. And I'm not saying every single picture and every single cover does this. But first of all, imagine if we are walking through a bookstore and we have to go through many book covers. This type of light and shadows, this type of composition catches the most attention. We are literally driving the eyes towards the center here. And then the second point is it's very accessible for text. So I don't know, I'm going to type up. I'm not saying this is a book cover per se, but every one of Frank Frazetta's pieces can be seen as sort of like a really nice fantasy book cover. So imagine if you had a book. Or whatever, I'm just going to leave it like this. Okay. So imagine you have text. Whoa. There we go. More fantasy. Text, for the most part, when you create a book cover, the text is going to be centered. So, what better way to create a composition than to have your main subject centered so that it balances out naturally? What I mean by this is, no matter how you create, however you put the text, it's gonna work with this sort of cover. Now, that's not to say that book covers won't have text that could be put on the left or the right side, especially when you're looking at maybe Japanese books or something. But for the most part, Western books tend to be centered. And when you're designing your subject matter, it tends to work if you are balanced around the center. I'm not saying that's what Frank Frazetta exactly did when he was thinking of creating this piece, but it kind of works conveniently, and which is why he is basically the godfather of fantasy art. And of course, the heavy shadows and lights makes it so that if you're walking through the bookstore, you'll really want to stop and look at this piece because it's so stark. You don't want to have a very mellow, very died down piece. This is going to be a little bit harder to catch attention, especially when you're surfing through so many books. But of course, we're in the digital age, so it might not be that big of a problem anymore. But anyways, this is sort of an introduction to Frank Frazetta's work. Again, with all these other artists, there's so many things I could say, but these are the 3 points that I really want to make, and hopefully you learned something. Anyways, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.